Happy Firewater Friday, everyone. I am Seth Brown, and you are listening to the Firewater Review. This week I am not joined by Aaron Cave. 'Tis the season for lovely scheduling conflicts and the usual holiday hustle. And we've tried to get a show on the books the past couple of weeks, but calendars just haven't jived too well. And that is life with kids for you, especially this time of year. Never fear, we'll be back in a couple of weeks with a regular episode, I'd say in the next week or two, hopefully. In the meantime, you're stuck with me, so my apologies. Today is Friday, December 8th, and it is a very cold day and very snowy day here in the Atlanta area. Some of you might recall, I think it was back in 2013, we had the Snowmageddon or whatever it was called, and I was one of the unfortunate souls that got stuck in that mess for 14 hours. And in that 14 hours, I made it a total of 7 miles and still didn't make it home. I ended up having to stay with a friend and then get up the next morning and hop back in the car and try again. Fortunately for me, though, during that time, I had a couple of empty beer growlers in the trunk of my car. And needless to say, those growlers will never be used for beer again. But ever since that whole Snowmageddon or Snowpocalypse happened, people have been a little gun-shy here in the Atlanta area when winter weather approaches. And a lot of people tend to work from home those days, and today is one of those days for me. So instead of leaving you with another episode of just flying solo with Seth, like I've done in the past, I decided to come downstairs this morning and record a show for you, do a little review. So on that note, several months ago, our friends at Luxrow introduced a new product to the Ezra Brooks lineup. That is Ezra Brooks Straight Rye Whiskey. And they were kind enough to send me a bottle earlier this year. And it just dawned on me recently that I never actually got around to reviewing it. So in that case, hopefully it is better late than never. So in this episode, we will be reviewing that whiskey. I will be reviewing that whiskey with you. That is Ezra Brooks Straight Rye Whiskey. It is distilled and aged by MGP and bottled by Ezra Brooks, which is owned by Luxrow. And the mash bill is a 95% rye, 5% malted barley mash bill, and it is aged 2 years. And as I mentioned earlier, it was released earlier this year in, I think, February in 2017. It is a 90 proof whiskey, 45% ABV, and usually retails around $20. And it's just been in the last, I'd say 4 months or so that I've seen it popping up around Atlanta on shelves. So that is the rundown of the straight rye whiskey from Ezra Brooks. Aaron is, as you know, typically the one that provides all of the background, the history on the whiskeys that we review on the show. But with it just being me today, I didn't want to change that part up. So I would like to share a little history on Ezra Brooks with you today. So filling in for Aaron, here we go. Ezra Brooks was created back in 1957 by a gentleman by the name of Frank Silverman. It was produced under the name of Ezra Brooks Distilling Company and was likely distilled at the old Hoffman Distillery in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. And we know for sure that it was bottled there, and everyone just assumes that it was also distilled there. The Hoffman Distillery was owned at the time by the Rippey family, which, if you know your bourbon history, they were the founders of Wild Turkey. Anyway, this just goes to show that whiskeys have long since been sourced from other distilleries, so it's really nothing new to the game. I think it gets a lot of news nowadays. People kind of frown on it, but in my opinion, as long as the companies that are doing the sourcing are upfront about it, I personally don't have a problem with it, especially if it's good whiskey. Something else that isn't new to the industry are lawsuits. Back in the early days of Ezra Brooks, well, I guess maybe even now. It was long considered to be a Jack Daniels lookalike, so much so that Jack Daniels actually filed a lawsuit against Mr. Silverman back in, I think, around the late 1950s for intentionally copying and imitating the appearance of Jack Daniels' Black Label, and that included the packaging and advertising techniques. Jack Daniels would eventually go on to lose that lawsuit. During the 1960s, I believe the brand changed hands once or twice and might have even landed in the Beam portfolio of whiskeys. And then in the 1970s, the Medley Company acquired the brand and moved the distillation to the Medley Distillery, which is now the O.Z. Tyler Distillery in Owensboro, Kentucky, in my old neck of the woods of western Kentucky, where the brand fairly quickly became one of their number one selling products for several years. And then around 1991, United Distillers, which is now Diageo, purchased the distillery and its portfolio from Medley, and then 1 year later, in 1992, closed the distillery. And then the very next year, in 1993, Luxrow, which was then the David Sherman Corporation, purchased the Ezra Brooks brand. And then the distillation of the bourbon was moved to the Heaven Hill Distillery, where it has stayed ever since then. The rye, originally announced, as I mentioned before, in February of this year, is a new product to the Ezra Brooks line. And the current stock, as I mentioned earlier, is sourced from MGP. Eventually, that distillation, actually all of the distillation of the Ezra Brooks products, will be moved to the Luxrow Distillery, which is being constructed right now in Bardstown, Kentucky. And that's pretty much the history of Ezra Brooks as we know it. As if I haven't changed things up enough on this episode of Firewater Review without my normal partner in crime, Aaron, I'm going to change it up just a bit more on you. As most regular listeners know, we normally take a break and we try the whiskey during the break, and sometimes even before we even hit record. So instead of doing that, I'm just going to pop open the bottle here and provide the notes right now. So here we go. All right. On the nose, you can really pick up the youth of this whiskey here. As I mentioned before, it's a 2-year-old whiskey. I do get some nice rye spice with it, and a little bit of fresh oak. And then there's a very light mixture of some black and red pepper that's going on here. It does have some sweeter and kind of fruitier notes to it. I get a little bit of sweet caramel and maybe some green apple. Overall, it's not too bad. It doesn't have too bad of a nose on it. It's not super complex, but keep in mind we are talking about a 2-year-old whiskey that has been cut and filtered. On top of that, I'm getting a lovely sinus infection, so there's that to consider as well. So let's take a quick sip here. It's not super complex. While it does have a decent mouthfeel, I'm finding it a little bit thin for my liking. Still, it's not terrible for its youth, though. I get a little bit of oak on it, some vanilla, a pinch of mint that seems to pop in on a lot of the MGP ryes, and it gets, again, some good rye spice to it. But like I said, not overly complex and a tad thin for my liking. Then in on the finish, I'm getting a little bit of cinnamon spice to it. I do get more of that light oak coming in again. It gets a little sweeter towards the very end of it, bringing back some of the caramel and vanilla flavors. Overall, I mean, the rye has a lot of potential. I don't know, unfortunately, that we'll ever see much of that potential, though. At least not from the MGP mash bill, anyway. I'll be interested in seeing what the folks at Luxrow do with this. I could see them possibly introducing an older, higher proof rye at some point while they wait for the Luxrow distilled product to be ready in that transition period. I mean, overall, I think it's not a bad whiskey, especially at $20. It's just not as complex and bold as the whiskeys that I tend to like. That said, I think it can stand up on its own, or would certainly do well in a good cocktail. Overall, I'm giving this an 84 out of 100. And again, this is Ezra Brooks Straight Rye Whiskey, 90 proof, and 2 years old. 95% rye, 5% malted barley mash bill. I think it's a solid rye. It's just, like I said, not as bold and complex as I tend to like my whiskeys, especially ryes. If you're into cocktails, pick it up. I tend to skew more towards rye-based cocktails or higher rye bourbon-based cocktails. So if that's in your wheelhouse, then this is worth trying. I mean, I know Rittenhouse rye, which is a little bit higher proof. It's 100 proof. That's a good solid one that a lot of cocktail bars will use for their rye-based cocktails. This is a good one to throw in the mix as well. So if you find it into cocktails or even want to just give it a shot on its own, give it a shot, man. $20. You're not going to go too wrong with that. So that's it for this episode of the Fire Water Review. Short, sweet, and just me. So hopefully next week we'll have another episode with Aaron and I, or perhaps a guest. But we'll see. Hopefully our schedules will get back on track and you can have both of us and not just lonely me. I can be found on Instagram, Seth P. Brown, and Twitter as well, at Seth P. Brown, hardly ever. You can find this show on Instagram at Firewater Review. You can find the show to listen to in iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. We're also on YouTube, audio only, no video. And you can, of course, find all of our shows on abvnetwork.com. And we appreciate your feedback. Let us know what you want us to review. We'd love to hear from you. And that is it for this episode of Firewater Review. Again, I reviewed Ezra Brooks Straight Rye Whiskey, and I gave it an 84 out of 100. Until next time, stay warm, and please drink responsibly. Cheers.
The Firewater Review is part of the ABV Network. For more information or to become a sponsor, please visit abvnetwork.com. Thanks for listening, and cheers.